Before we move on, I wanted to address two items related to our unit tests. First, recall that I'm using this naming convention. I didn't elaborate on it much at the time, but essentially the first part is the method name. The second part would be the state that's under test. And then the third is the expected behavior. So originally I justified this by we were creating a contract, a new instance of contract. So in this case, the contract indicates that we were calling the constructor on that class. The state under test would be that we want to pass it a valid contract ID, and then the expected behavior is that it would return a contract, a valid contract. And then we kind of follow that same naming convention for the second one, and I just added the term expired. Giving it an expired contract ID, I would expect it to return an expired contract. And so unfortunately, what happened was our method names didn't change, even though we changed and we're no longer using contract the same way that we did originally when we set it up. So we need to refactor this. The unit test itself is really not named correctly. The unit test file and class name should reflect the domain class that we're testing. Now that we've refactored a lot of the functionality out of contract itself and into the contract service class, in order to be consistent, I feel like we need to move things around a little bit and rename a few things. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a new unit test in my test project called contract service test. So I'm going to right click, select add new item, a new basic unit test. I'm going to call this contract service test.cs. And now I'm going to basically cut almost everything out of this contract test. Let me just go ahead and roll it all up so we can see it at a high level. I'm going to select everything out of here and just hit Control X on my keyboard. I'm going to go back to the contract service test, and I'm going to replace essentially everything inside of the class. And you'll see that there are a lot of things that we'll need to resolve, and I could take the time and add these using statements myself, but ReSharper will do that for me. I just need to click on it and it will take care of it for me. But essentially, I just need to make sure that all the using statements match whatever I had previously. Let's move this over here. In my old class. Okay. So now I want to run all the unit tests again, and I make sure that everything still passes, even though I moved their container from the old unit test class to the new unit test class. All right, so we're good there. All right, next I want to rename the unit test. We're no longer testing the constructor of the contract class, but rather we're testing the getById method of the contract service class. So I need to change the names to reflect that. So what I'll do is I'm going to change this to getById, and this name as well from contract to getById. And I'm going to save it, and I'm going to rerun all the tests, and I notice that the test names have changed and they still run. So we're making sure everything's still good. And now let's take a look at the unit tests themselves. There's a lot of extra code in here we no longer need. So that's the first order of business. I'm going to rip all that out. And I'm going to rip all this out as well. Great. And let's roll that up. And we'll come back to that later. Now, when you take a look at the unit tests, they follow a pattern. And I did that intentionally. It's called arrange, act, and assert. Here, let me kind of spell it out for you here, and with some code comments. So in the arrange portion of a unit test, you put in all the necessary preconditions and inputs. In our case, we're arranging the test by creating an instance of the contract service using the contract repository from Fake It Easy. So we're getting everything ready. We're arranging the test to run. The second step is to act. Here, we want to act on the object or the method under test. In our case, we're calling the getById method, and this is what will produce the results. So that is where we are acting, okay? And then the third section is the assertion, the assert. So this is where we test for the expected results to make sure that they've occurred. Now in our case, we're checking a few results, namely that the object returned by the method under test is giving us the correct data type, a contract, and that the new contract's properties are set to what we would expect. Now, if you're just getting started in creating unit testing, this pattern can help you get everything squared away properly. And so you'll see some people will actually add these comments, arrange, act, and assert, and then fill in the blanks. And I would highly encourage that. That's what I do. At some point, though, you don't need that little framework anymore. You'll just remember arrange, act, assert, and you'll just code it that way, right? Now, this is a little bit nitpicky, but I prefer less code to more code. And so each of the unit tests that we're creating a new instance of, we're creating a new instance of the contract service, right? So this line of code and here, this line of code are exactly the same. So what I might prefer to do is to move that to the initialize, and we'll create a private variable called contract service, which I'll use throughout the unit tests. So we'll do something like this. And then inside of here, where I pass in the contract repository. Okay? And now what I can do is essentially just get rid of this line of code here in the arrange. And I'll need to change this to use our new contract service reference. There. And I can do the same thing in our other unit test as well. So this will make our range lonely, but that's okay. In fact, I'm going to strip those comments out as well and get rid of them, like you can see here. And so like I said earlier, at some point you're going to tire of adding them, and other developers will tire of looking at them, and they should just assume that you're following this pattern anyway. It's what everybody does, all right? And then in the initialize here, right after the auto mapper, what I'll do is I will, I'm going to add contract service equals new contract service, passing in our contract repository, all right? Now that I do that, I can remove this line of code and then change my reference to the contract service to our new variable that we created and populated in the initialize, and do the same thing here. All right, and so, you know, our arrange looks a little bit lonely right now. I can actually strip out all these comments. You'll tire of adding them at some point, and other developers will just assume that you're using this pattern. I generally just leave a space to kind of separate them. I might have other initialization tasks that cannot be separated out between the two, or it may not make sense to do this sort of refactoring if other tests don't need this contract service or need a different contract service. And so this might be a little bit early to do this sort of refactoring. However, I just decided to do it just to talk about making things compact and small and very readable. Okay, so you can do that at your own discretion. But at any rate, we'll want to make sure that our tests run, and they do. Very good. Okay, so a little moving around, a little renaming to consistently apply the rules of unit testing to our work. Keeping our work area clean and sticking to our self-imposed rules will help us to stay productive as we add more and more code to our project. Okay, so we're ready to move on and add more unit tests and more functionality. We'll start that in the next lesson. Thank you.